Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to it. Phenomenal job today in class. Mainly shout out my C and D period, G period. I haven't seen you yet, but I know you're going to do great too. But the big thing about it, though, is we are now diving headfirst into another section of our exploration unit where we're now basically talking about the rise of colonies in this newly discovered territories in both, in both North and South America as the Europeans begin to show up and settle these different places coming from their areas of Europe right here. And see how cute this Prezi is? Like, look, I got little lines about these people going this way and then these people going this way. And so it's very, very important that you understand the rise of colonial systems. What happens to the natives when these colonies begin to rise up? What happens and why are certain things that we've learned in other history classes when we were in middle school, why were they occurring? Things like that. For example, Ava Kirsch wrote down in her notes a question that she had for me during a flip and that she showed to me when we talked about it. Like, if you have questions like that, do that. Be like Ava Kirsch and actually write these things down because it's an awesome way to actually be able to learn and understand the whys and the hows to everything we discuss in this class. But diving straight forward into it, we're talking about the rise of colonies. Now, we talked about this in a warm-up recently. A colony is a word that we don't really need to write down the definition for because you know what it is. It's just kind of hard to explain. But basically what it is, it's a settlement of a foreign country in a different area. And that settlement is basically there for economic or political gain, right? So the big thing about it, though, is so we're here, now what, right? So once the Europeans arrive in these new lands, particularly North and South America, we're going to be starting off with the Spanish. They're going to show up and decide that they're going to actually start erecting colonial sections, colonial atmosphere, and colonial economics all over these different continents, right? So looking at this entire thing, by the mid-1500s, Spain in particular claimed a vast empire that stretched all the way from California in North America all the way down to the tip of South America, all the way into Argentina. So looking at this map really, really quickly right here, everything in pink and red you can actually see belongs to Spain, right? So notice all of these different little items right here as well, and you've got some other little areas popping up. So you've got the Philippines belongs to Spain. You've got this entire northern section of South America, all the way down through Peru, all the way down into Chile and Argentina, and then also even all the way up into the mid-section of the Midwest. Now, granted, this is actually after a certain war, but as you can see, Spain owns a lot of land, and they claimed an empire that was almost 25% of the inhabited world, right? Which is bananas. And we're going to talk about the one guy who apparently gets to rule over that entire amount of areas. It's Charles V. We talked about him in the Reformation period. He's coming back up. Now, the biggest thing, though, going into it is by the mid-1500s, Spain, and as well as the Portuguese and the British and the French are adopting these motivators for why they want to go and do this, why they want to show up in these different areas, what is driving them to do that. And the big three motivators are the things that I'm about to say that you need to write down. They all start with G, and they're very easy to remember. It's gold, God, glory, right? So gold, God, and glory is something that historians use to kind of describe the motivations behind Europeans creating colonial empires overseas in North and South America, as well as some other weaker areas of the world that existed during that time period, right? So going forward, or getting into it a little bit, let's start off with one of these G's, right? Let's start off with God, shall we? So let's talk about spreading Christianity, okay? So when the Spanish show up, the explorers feel that they have to convert the natives. They feel that it's going to be positive to convert the natives. But the big question is, why? Why did the explorers feel that they had to convert the natives? What would be positive about converting them? A lot of historians argue this back and forth regularly. Some historians argue that they were using it as an excuse to when the natives actually refused, they could actually put military action onto them. Some historians believe also that the oncoming Reformation that was kind of on the horizon in 1517 was going to drive the Spanish to convert as many people to Catholicism and avoid them going to Protestantism, right? To spread their faith as far as they possibly could. But regardless of the answer to that, a big thing you need to understand is when the Spanish arrive in North and South America by the beginning of the Reformation period, that they believe that winning souls for Christianity, particularly Catholic Christianity, is going to be just as important as winning land, right? So now, as you can see right here with this picture of Columbus standing next to that cross, one of our early red flags that things could go kind of south for the natives going forward, is that the Spanish, with the help of the Catholic Church, are going to work to convert the natives by building churches and regulating Spanish settlers. One of the biggest positive things that some Catholic priests did during this colonial atmosphere and during this colonial process is they did try to attempt to regulate some of the Spanish settlers and be like, you cannot do this to these native people. They are going to be God's children as well. So that's one of the positive things things going into it when it actually discusses like the building of churches and the building of villages and the helping of the natives in this way. Now, however, the Spanish, though, are going to also later use the refusal of some natives as justification of violence and aggressive action. So this is kind of a double-edged sword, or a really weird situation where you're talking about the spreading of Christianity to people that are the natives of Central, South, and North America. And remember, when I say natives, I mean Aztec, Inca, Maya, Cherokee, Iroquois, Occaneechi, like any type of native person that lived in these two places before the Europeans ever arrived. So a big thing, though, that we are going to kind of talk about and then just kind of keep moving on past is that the spreading of Christianity was majorly important to the Europeans. And like we said, there were some political motivations behind it. In 1517, the Reformation does begin, so of course the Catholics are going to work to convert as many of the natives as possible to that entire to Catholic Christianity, rather than being possibly like prey to Protestantism, right? So now the big thing too also is that the Jesuits were apparently heavily a part of this conversion process, right? So now look, going into it though, now we got controlling trade, right? It's going to be one of the other big motivators, particularly about the Spanish. So when we're talking about all this right now, we're mainly right now focusing on the Spanish colonizers and the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish arriving in these new areas, right? A big thing they want to do also is control trade, right? And they want to control trade because it's going to make them an excessive amount of money. That's their big gold motivator, right? Our big gold motivator is going to be super, super important. And to the Spanish, the valuable thing for Spain coming from the Americas was gold and silver. Let's not kind of cut anything through this or kind of like misunderstand, is that gold and silver coming out of mines that the Spanish were digging were the two most valuable things that they wanted to get their hands on. They were going to use advanced tools as well. I know I was talking to Haley Lala about this today. Like, whereas the natives only had rock tools and things like that and still had access to a lot of gold, the Spanish are going to now come in using tools that are made out of forgeable metals and things like that and dig deeper mines than the natives ever could. And so using these advanced tools, they're going to dig deeper mines, but they're also going to force the natives to actually work inside of these mines. Now, we'll talk about that system of forced labor and stuff like that here in a second, but as you can see, these natives are now going to be mining gold far deeper than they ever would have had the ability to, but they're also working in conditions that are very hazardous to their health, safety, and their life. Because it's not like you see Spanish people walking down here and going and getting this gold. They're forcing the natives that already lived there to go down there and go and get that gold. Using, of course, more advanced tools. As you can see, all of these natives now have metal shovels and metal pickaxes as well, things they never would have had access to. And the Spanish are going to bring in this heavy amount of gold and silver and convert it mostly into monetary funds. Right here is a bunch of actual Spanish coins and Spanish currency that is going to be made out of the silver and gold coming out of the mines of North and South America. Now, funny enough, that thing's going to come back and bite them a little bit later on when they actually gain too much money too quickly, causing inflation, right? Now, natives, though, are also going to be forced to work in these mines in absolutely awful conditions. Conditions that include no ventilation, conditions that include no protective equipment, conditions that include possible explosion if you hit a gas vein or certain other things, or another big one, mine collapse, right? These mines are not like ones that you see in the Americas now that are reinforced with wood siding and reinforced on the edges to make sure that the actual mine does not collapse in on itself. These are primitive mines and simple mines that are just dug deep down into the earth that were prone to collapse at any minute. And again, the Spanish would not go down there themselves. They were forcing natives to go down there, right? And we'll talk again, like I said, about the system that actually pushed them to do this. Now, continuing with this controlling trade as well, this gold motivation, this big overarching idea that we use to basically just describe the Spanish using the natives and using native land and native resources to make excessive amounts of money. To keep going forward as well, you also have to talk about agricultural stuff that is going to be like actually drawn out of these different colonial areas. If you can't hear me right now, it's because I don't want my computer to die, and I'm trying to plug this bad boy up really quick, okay? So going into it, though, or trying to understand it, there are things that grow in these areas naturally as well that the Spanish want to try and use to make some money. So the colonies are going to also ship not only gold and silver back to their mother countries, and particularly Spain, but Spain also wants to use raw materials that can be grown in these areas, right? Examples of raw materials include like foodstuffs, like new vegetables and things discovered in North and South America. Cotton, we're going to use that as an example, and it's the only reason I have that word on there, but it's pretty irrelevant, and I'll talk about why here in a second. But then another big one, sugarcane, right? So now what a raw material is, notice I have raw materials right here in all capital letters for a reason. What a raw material is any good that is grown and has not been processed. So it's in its natural state. And so I made this little like picture thing to try and explain what raw materials are and explain what's going on and how the Europeans are going to use this to make an excessive amount of money. So let's use cotton, right? Let's use the example of cotton. Now, the thing about it is cotton is grown on a plant that looks like this, right? That is where cotton comes from. And at this time, most of the world's cotton was actually being grown in India. And again, I'll get to this whole contradiction or whatever, but I'm trying to use this plant as an example of how this raw material conversion happens. So that right there is cotton in its natural form. It blooms out of these little buds and it creates these little things that you have to pull off, and you got to take the seeds of it out. And then you can actually string that into thread and weave it and spin it into thread, and then you can weave it into a finished product. So this is the processed good that is made out of cotton, like a cotton shirt, right? That is processed. This is a raw material. It's in its natural state. So the Spanish want to actually harvest raw materials from the colonies, bring them back to Europe, give them to artisans, guilds, or small factory owners, and have them make them into processed goods, right? So now the reason why I keep saying don't worry about cotton, don't kind of store that in your mind, is because that is not what the Spanish were growing. And typically speaking, whenever you've been in an American education system, the only thing you ever hear about cotton is the growing of cotton in North and South, or in North America, particularly in the lower 48 states, especially in the agrarian South. But that doesn't start up until the 1700s. What was actually being grown more than anything else in North America and South America during this time was sugarcane, right? Sugarcane grew so well in the Caribbean that they literally called the Caribbean islands the Sugar Islands, right? So sugarcane was the most profitable crop that could be grown in Central and South America. Now, looking at it, it's because of what it can be made into, right? Sugarcane is a very, very easy product to make into multiple other things. Sugarcane can be made into sugar, molasses, and rum, right? Now, ironically enough, you need molasses to make sugar. The first two items are, well, molasses is the key thing. You make molasses out of sugarcane. And molasses is this thick, brown, gooey substance that you get from actually milking the sugarcane and then boiling that down, right? And you can then actually crystallize it and make sugar, or you can ferment it and make rum, right? And rum, of course, being the alcoholic drink that pirates always talk about, right? So now, but just like the mines, sugar requires a very large workforce, okay? And the original people working on these things, on these farms, on these plantations, and in these areas are, the natives, right? So, it's very, very important to understand who's working in these areas and who is being forced to do this, right? So looking at this right here, that is sugarcane, right? That is what sugarcane looks like in its raw form. It grows like a stalk very, very easily in certain warm and very, very tropical slash climactic areas. Now looking at it though, it requires a huge workforce to harvest it, grow it, and then literally process it, right? So what this is, as you can see, these are all natives. Natives holding the sugar cane, natives cooking the sugar cane down into molasses and putting it into different jugs. And so who and how did the Spanish force the natives to actually do all this work? Well, they did it by enforcing this system, a system known as the Encomienda, right? Encomienda is a system of forced labor that the Spanish were forcing onto the natives and making them actually do the work for them, right? So the Encomienda is a system of forced labor that gave colonists the right to force the natives to work by law, right? And why do I have the word refusal question mark on there? It's because theoretically what would happen if natives refused to do this? Well, they could literally be arrested, mutilated, sometimes having parts of their body cut off, actually being physically punished, or having their family taken hostage, right? So as you can see, this is a very, very violent, very aggressive system. And this little thing right here that you don't need to write down, because if you understand it, you don't need to write it down. Notice what I said, you don't need to write this little thing down. But the plan for the Encomienda was that Spanish would be like, oh, well, we're going to settle there, protect, care for, and Christianize the natives, and the natives will only work a part of their day in exchange for us helping them. But in reality, what was actually happening is that Spanish settlers forced long labor, didn't pay the Native American workers, failed to protect them, and seized their land when they would die, right? And natives died from diseases and harsh living and working conditions, right? So the Encomienda finally ended after the Catholic Church protested this, and also after several Native American results, right? Now, of course, this is going to continue, but the big thing about it, though, is that the natives worked mainly in two locations during this forced enslavement, right? And they were working mainly in the mines and on sugarcane plantations. Now, the one that was more dangerous to work in were the mines. The mines would kill thousands of natives through poor conditions, no ventilation, exhaustion, collapse, and things like that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And also, the mines were especially used for children. Like, children were heavily used to actually work. Native children were heavily used to work in the mines in these areas because they were very small and actually could get into small holes and drag large carts or open ventilation windows to try and vent out dangerous gas in these mines. So as you can see, the Encomienda system is absolutely horrid and actually led to the death of thousands of people. And this right here is a Spanish settler, as you can see, holding a whip, forcing Native Americans to plant sugarcane. So as you can see, like I said, it's a very, very messed up system. And the Encomienda is going to, along with contact from disease, is going to kill as many as 90% of some pre-Columbian native societies. The Taino, over 90% of them end up dead because of the Encomienda system and the spread of dangerous disease, right? Because of these two things, that means that the Spanish are now literally doing, like running out of their labor force, which is one of the most horrible things to even utter. It's like, oh, darn it, we're running out of our labor force. How about you should have just left them alone in the first place, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that this is causing the Europeans, though, to then replace the natives with African slaves. So that right there is the key moment when the Encomienda system begins to die off because the natives are actually suffering from what is could be considered a genocide. They are dying off, and then the Europeans are going to replace those natives who are perishing with slaves from Africa, right? And that's going to turn North America, South America, Central America into what you would consider like a slave society, right? And we will discuss that a little bit more as we get further into this unit. So keeping going, though, colonial society and culture is also going to boom during this time period, okay? The big thing you need to understand is that Europeans are going to place large colonies on this newly conquered land. You're going to see the growth of some places like so in Puerto Rico, for example, there's a very, very large city that started out as a Spanish colony. And Puerto Rico actually is literally named as a Spanish colony. Puerto Rico meaning rich port, right? Or a rich port city, okay? So like Havana is going to be a massive place in Cuba that is going to be an early Spanish colony. You're going to see other places as well, like Mexico City, DF, and other areas throughout the whole of South America that are going to be these newly established colonies that the Spanish are going to use to make an aggressive amount of money off these raw materials and off these mined metals. Now, an interesting little part about this, though, is that the Spanish also passed laws on those colonists saying that they could only trade with Spain. So this is what's called an embargo, right? So basically what I mean by this word embargo is the Spanish are saying to their colonists, you may only trade or buy items that are coming to and from Spain, okay? And then also this is going to lead to a massive amount of smuggling as well. And smuggling and what that is means that people are going to secretly buy and sell goods from other people like the British or the French or the Dutch and stuff like that. So there's an interesting little component going on here that the gold that's being mined from a lot of these Spanish mines is ending up in the hands of other Europeans because they're actually paying it out. Now we'll talk about this other big thing called mercantilism and this little stuff a little bit later on, but what you need to know right now is that all these mother countries were like, you may only buy your goods from us, and that's what's known as like a trade embargo. And as you can see, the colonies are beginning to grow. They included government buildings, churches, large homes, and things like that by the announcements or whatever. But getting back into it, those embargoes, those smuggling things are very, very important. However, as you can see with these growing Spanish colonies, including big government buildings, very, very large transport systems that are actually moving these raw materials in and out, it's going to lead also to very close interactions between Europeans that were coming and colonizing these areas, natives, and the Africans that are being brought in on these different slave vessels. So in Spanish settlements, though, in particular, notice I have the word Spanish right there in all caps. You also have to understand that this causes a large amount of new social classes and racial mixing. So something that you need to understand is that most of the Spanish colonists were men, right? Single men that were going to these colonies as a way to make money. They were getting there, and then they were meeting native women, African women, and things like that. And so that's going to lead lead to the establishment of new social classes to try and include these new people of mixed race. So, for example, Latin American people to this day are the youngest race of people that has ever existed because they actually are originally connected to this group right here known as mestizo, right? And mestizo is when there would be a Spanish man and a native woman, and they would have a child. That child would be considered mestizo because they had European blood. And then you had this word as well, mulatto, which is not a word that we use in common society. Do not walk around and just say this word. It's very rude and offensive. But it is actually when there would be a Spanish man and an African woman, and they would actually have a child together, and that person would be known as this new class, known as a mulatto. So these are really important to know because as we begin to progress forward, you're going to need to understand that the Spanish colonial system is growing and they're adding a lot of new social classes to the Spanish colonial system, which later on is going to become very, very hard to keep track of, and it's also going to lead to these things called the Latin American independence movements. So do me a favor and highlight these two groups of people and make sure you know that that is like literally the different races that mix together to make these people and what they actually mean. And also it's very, very important to highlight this single Spanish men thing because it makes a lot of sense and kind of helps you understand the progressive history going forward. So getting into it though a little bit as well is now we're going to leave South America behind and we're going to allow the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish settlers to continue to grow these colonies, and we're going to let that kind of cook up and we're going to bring it back and talk about it, how the actual Spanish government dealt with this entire system a little bit later on. But now what we're going to be getting into is this last little thing that we're going to be talking about going into our next class, which is the struggles for North America, right? So now the big thing about it is notice what we said when we looked at that original map with the Spanish colonies. There's a lot of North America in the middle, but there was a large part of it still left unclaimed, right? So when we actually looked at this map originally. There it is. So the Spanish are going to actually start in this area and expand south and then north. But what's up with all this gray right here that was never claimed by the Spanish? Well, who gets dibs on that, or who tried to colonize that first? Because while the Spanish and the Portuguese settled in Central and South America, particularly the Portuguese being in Brazil, they might have settled there, but other Europeans had eyes on North America, particularly the east coast of the North America, as well as what is now modern-day Canada. So that is really a big question of who are going to be the two countries that claim vast amounts of territory in that area. Let's take a minute to see if you can guess.
The final Jeopardy category today is 3 named women. Let's take a look at the clue.
Well, for either of you three that I put on there, or for any of you people that said British and French, you are correct. The English and the French are going to be the two that try to go in and colonize most of North America. Now, the French are going to show up and basically attempt to build what you could refer to as a new France. And we are going to start right there when I see you again in class. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.